Welcome to today's reading and reflection for Thursday, the 24th of September. Our reading today is from Acts chapter 17, beginning to read at verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that this divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof to this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Just over 2 years ago, I first met with Stephen and Michael to discuss the possibility of me serving my curacy here in Horwich and Rivington. Over the few weeks that followed, I was given time to observe as I visited church services and experienced some of the similarities and differences from the church I was already attending. I noticed each church had its own characteristics, just as each person has their own characteristics and personality. As I joined the team, I actually had to follow Paul's teaching on arriving somewhere new. These words in this passage. Thankfully, I haven't come across any idols carved out of gold or silver or stone with teachings and some strange beliefs. But the teaching here is just as relevant. We look at the context before we look at anything else. I spent time watching and listening and learning, something we all need to do. Always. In this passage, from Acts, Luke is giving us a record of Paul's interaction with a group of philosophers in Athens. His tact and his skill at communicating the gospel to this group is fantastic. He's waiting there for his companions, Silas and Timothy, as they'd left early because of the risk of violence from an unruly mob. We can't help but think that Paul, who's there supposedly waiting, isn't waiting idly. He doesn't just use it as an opportunity to do nothing. He isn't someone who wants inactivity. He sees this city full of idols and he's distressed and he's moved into action. God alone is great. And he doesn't like seeing these idols of stone or gold or silver that were stealing praise from God. So he begins to preach, both in the synagogue and in the marketplace. And some of the philosophers debate with him and invite him to come and address the Areopagus, a society of philosophers. The philosophers are ridiculed for doing nothing but sitting around and talking about the latest ideas. Their laziness might have been a character flaw, but it certainly gave Paul the opportunity to share the gospel message. This extraordinary speech is packed with wisdom about how to share the gospel in a critical setting. What was relevant then is still as relevant now. Paul doesn't ignore this pluralistic culture that he finds himself in. He knows it's important. He's observed it. He's thought about it. And if we ignore the culture of the world around us, we are negligent. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But to people who don't know Jesus, they need to understand the relevance of this for themselves. And we can only share that when we understand the culture. When we consider the culture, we should look at a whole range of things, because those are often the things that define us. What makes us tick, our politics, our social aspects, our morals, what inspires us, what excites us, what frustrates us, as well as how we understand things. See, once Paul knew something of this, he was able to speak in an informed way. He found an opening to talk about Jesus. And so he starts by commending the philosophers for the slightest bit of good. Though they were idolaters, he starts by commending their religiousness. It's a bit of a backhanded compliment, really. It's a positive approval before anything else is said. These comments on religiousness isn't Paul approving of the idolatry, but he's noticing how committed they are to it, and he quickly then condemns worshipping idols. But Paul resists the urge to point the finger at their sinful behaviour. Last year I visited Rhodes, one of the Greek islands, and I was struck by how much importance was placed on the Greek gods. But alongside that was the importance of Christianity. It was apparent that the tension between false gods and the one true God is just as apparent today as it was when Paul visited those islands all those years ago. Paul was affirming the majesty, the sovereignty of God, and it's so important when we consider the lifeless rocks of the idols that they were worshipping. He wanted them to discover that God was superior to everything else, and he includes the things that people seek to fill his place in their lives. These verses remind us that God is personal, and he wants a personal relationship with each one of us. Jesus spoke using parables, stories that people could easily relate to. He spoke in their context. He knew exactly who he was talking to and how they would best be able to understand the message he was sharing. Paul quotes their poets. He was an educated man. He was well read. And in the same way, we can see that happening. He draws the points from the sources that they were likely to agree with, that they could understand. In the same way, we see things in films or on TV series which provide us with openings for so many conversations about Jesus. Not everything has to start from somewhere serious. Paul is really gracious to them, because even though he's condemning idolatry in general, he doesn't point the finger. He leaves them something to think about. He doesn't just dictate to them, but he still critiques their behaviour honestly. He doesn't leave it there, because he calls them to repent, to admit the things they've done, and he issues them a warning that judgment is coming. Despite the cultural awareness, he's less concerned about being as culturally relevant as he moves on to tell the essential parts of the message. They need to know the truth. Yes, he draws on biblical knowledge throughout, but Paul never directly quotes the Bible here, which might seem a little bit strange to us, but in that context, Paul was speaking to those whose words these would not have been seen as being authoritative. The words from the Bible would not have necessarily been seen as accurate, and so it seems that Paul's decided it was better not to quote from it. Whereas when Paul addresses a Jewish audience, he quotes the Bible constantly. Paul's approach has worked because we discover that there's another opportunity where he can continue to tell them about Christ. We discover that people have started to follow because of the approach he's taken. There's so much more here that we can learn from. When we share something of the cultural experiences of others, we gain so much knowledge. Each of us as Christians are given the task to share the good news about Jesus. We've got to share it with others, a task that's crucial. We've got to be effective, not just faithful. We've got to connect with the culture, just like Paul, and to share this gospel in a way that more people will believe and experience the love of Jesus on a personal level. It isn't a case of this is how it's all been. The world is changing at a faster pace than it has ever done before. But God is the same yesterday, today and forever. Let's just make the context relevant.